That's what I want, yeah.
To go outside camps to the cities. And in addition, this requires having some resources for transportation and accommodation. Altogether, this is quite complex, particularly for female refugees. Sometimes refugees miss deadlines while waiting for pass permit to apply for jobs. And at the same time, the camp experience of refugees is also narrated in terms of contributing for community through associations like the Eritrean Refugees University Graduates and Students Association, in which almost all the participants were members, and DAFI clubs, where they serve community, exchange information, and also raise some resources through these associations. For refugees in the cities, they engage particularly on follow-up of processes of resettlement, of family reunification. They are busy with connecting with family and friends using these technologies, and they are also very busy with applying for vacancies throughout the cities. But then the biggest challenge is cost of living in the cities. And as the result, they accept usually low-paying jobs. And some in the cities resorted to informal traditional mechanisms to find employment, particularly Somali refugees. So with regards to future aspirations and options in the conditions that I've tried to present, I mean, it's surprisingly, all refugee participants have explained a sort of identical aspiration for the future, leaving, Ethiopia to where there are better opportunities. However, all of them say that higher education has disrupted the rush to leave Ethiopia, and it provided window of opportunity to explore more options and provided additional means to try legal pathways. And particularly, the additional pathway is scholarship for master's level education in Europe, particularly. But it is extremely difficult for camp refugees to pursue scholarship as an option due to multiple challenges related to connectivity problems, some skill challenge to work out these applications, and mainly the resource constraints. And added to this, refugees have experience of multiple failures, and this led to fatigue, and some are considering dropping altogether scholarship as an option. But in this study, I have seen also some successful stories where refugee graduates have successfully made their way and got scholarships in Europe. Another big challenge that all refugees narrate is problems related to work permit. Though the Ethiopian Refugee Proclamation provides for right to work, but the subsidiary legislations, the directives, have a number of requirements that technically blocks refugees from getting work permits. So as far as my understanding from this study, it is almost impossible for refugees to get work permit due to several requirements which refugees cannot fulfill. And for many, lack of employment and continued dependence on family and food aid has led them towards more frustration and involving into secondary migration. And particularly female refugees raise some negative coping mechanisms, to deal with this lack of employment and income. And reportedly, there is this feeling of hopelessness, carelessness, and alcohol and drug addiction. And there is this potential for skill decay if refugees stay for long period without employment, or if they stay underemployed, like in the incentive work. And that can lead towards loss of knowledge and skills acquired from university education. And this has also a negative impact. This unemployment has a negative impact on the attendance, motivation, and achievement of school children in refugee camps, and a refugee community commitment to invest on children education. So based on these findings, I would conclude that higher education has benefits, lots of benefits for refugee graduates, but if post-bachelor degree experience are not rewarding, it can exacerbate vulnerabilities in a number of ways. Refugee graduates in this state are exposed to vulnerability in terms of particularly to harming circumstances and their consequences in a number of ways. Vulnerability of refugee graduates cannot, however, be generalized by gender. I've seen male and female refugees who are successful and also who are facing challenges. And it is diverse depending on various factors. For some refugee graduates, higher education opportunities in Ethiopia have significantly reduced vulnerability. So refugee graduates in this study are really prone to harm, powerlessness, and marginality in the camps particularly, and also in the cities, and with limited influence on the social systems they inhabit due to their legal status. So the findings of this study can show that policymakers and researchers need to understand the meaning and manifestations of vulnerability from the experience and narratives of refugees. And this study can add to the literature that can criticize the generalized notion of vulnerability, considering certain fixed categories of refugees as vulnerable. And thank you very much. Can you hear me, please?
Thank you.
Yes, you are back.
So thank you so much, Alibacho, for that presentation. It was wonderful. I want to usher in very quickly Abdi Kadir. And just like I mentioned, as he prepares, please put up your slide. Alibacho is an advocacy, campaign, communication, and media manager for Dadaab Response Association. He is actually a refugee, but at the moment he's living in his country in Somalia, so he went back there. He goes back and forth, and is a master's graduate of York University. He's actually a beneficiary of BHER, and we want to welcome him. Karibu, Abdi Kadir, you're welcome. Thank you.
And thank you, Dr. Rosemary, and the rest of the team. As Professor Rosemary introduced, this is Abdi Kadir Barre Abikar, one of the graduates first cohort BHER, Dadaab, York University. I graduated my Masters of Education and also Bachelor of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies, majoring in Geography. It's my honor today to present my study, which is a little bit different from, more similar with Professor Alibacho. So it is today, my Professor Alibacho is also presenting the other way, the benefits of higher education. I'm also looking at some possible benefits that a higher education provides, and looking into the graduates. BHER had 31 graduates so far, with the third cohort who are finishing their masters. And I was like, since I was one of them, how far has the master's graduate helped them? So before I started the project, I was thinking, like, can we use education as a durable solution, provided that UNHCR provides 3 different durable solutions: the resettlement, the relocation and reintegration, and the repatriation. So I was thinking that will education be also a pathway to durable solution? So this is the question that I came up with. Can graduate education be a pathway to durable solution for youths living in the displacement? We know that youths in the camp had several, issues with the struggles in life, and yet there are not enough, the resettlement opportunities are not enough, and higher educations were never enough because there are a lot of graduates of secondary education that requires further their studies. So when BHER came, there was a little bit, the load was a little bit reduced. So this is what I'm going to present, what I met with my okay. So with my research context, I was looking at, first of all, what problems are existing in the DAP on the higher education. So I find out that the current situation that exists is in the DAP, youth education for tertiary education. So youths really need tertiary education because they found that it is very beneficial for those youths, like for example, who are going back to their country. Majority of the youths in the DAP camp have, no tertiary education after completing their higher schools. This is because previously, before 10 years, we had like 7 secondary schools in 3 camps, Ifo, Dagahale, Hagadera, those camps in the DAP. Currently, we are having as much as 30 secondary schools, which are producing every year. They're producing like 1,000, 2,000 secondary graduates. If these youths are not, given higher education, they will end up losing their hope and maybe ending up, becoming a threat to the community. If you don't give them enough opportunity, either for work, you entertain them with education. So this is what I was looking at. So the problem currently we are having is there is minimum tertiary education. It's never enough. So every year, approximately more than 3,000 students finish their secondary schools from all the 3 camps in the DAP. There are only few scholarships provided to these youths, which is not satisfactory. And again, scholarships demands higher grades to be considered. So it's very hard for a student who got a low grade to be given, this scholarship. So we are like leaving many, like 60% of the students are not getting or even applying because of the grades. There is a lack of sustainable jobs. Youths are given to incentive jobs, even if they have the qualification. Whether you have masters, whether you have a degree, you still get an incentive job. You are same level with a class 8 leaver or level 8 leaver. So this is a challenge for the youths. Many graduates are aiming of going back to their country of origin to look for better jobs to sustain their families in the camp, because you have family, you have been working, you have been learning, and you need to give back to your family. So if you're given an incentive of $80 to $90 or $100, you can't satisfy. So the education had no meaning for you and your family. So my research question I was asking is, has the participating in the post-secondary education in the DAP refugee camp and specifically completing, for example, the master's education degree through the BHER, Borderless Higher Education for Refugee project, shaped the career pathways for graduates. And I looked at the research aims, which I wanted to describe the various career pathways following the graduations of refugee youths who have graduated from their masters at York University. I was also looking at to understand the factors that influence why educated refugees youth in the camp choose to stay in the camps or return to their countries of origin, because there are those who finish their masters and still decide to stay in the camp, and there are those who, when they finish their masters, they see that they cannot get the kind of job opportunity they wanted, so they go back to their country of origin and present their documents, because the documents are very valid for them. And again, to understand the hope and dreams and expectations of youths who complete master's degrees in the DAP, whether their situations following graduation meet these expectations. And also, I was examining the barriers that educated youths face in their careers. What are the barriers they face to reach to the level they are in? Also contribute to the discussion of how refugee created their own durable solutions that may not fit clearly within the three traditional durable solutions: repatriation, local integration, and resettlement. So can they create their own durable solutions, like not only going to resettlement, but can you create another opportunity to survive, which you think it is a solution for you? And then lastly, to make recommendations related to the future of the post-secondary educations in the DAP refugee camps and in similar refugee situations. In the research project, I focused with eight BHER graduates who are either in the camp or outside the camp to evaluate the impact of the master's study and knowledge. In fact, I was moving with some of them to Somalia, others in the DAP, to see how this study, how the study they have gotten, the experiences, the knowledge from BHER masters has really facilitated wherever they are. So my participants were 4 female and 4 male due to gender sensitivity. I conducted one-on-one interview with all the 8 participants to see the use of the master class, and lastly collect the data used to clean and used for research support of my question. What I found out, there are very many things I found out, but 2 of the things stands the most. 1, the BHER program influenced the beneficiaries, the youths in the camp, positively. Students have the option either to go back to their country of origin or to remain in the camp. However, what is important is not going back as a solution, that whatever you go, wherever you go, the knowledge, skills, and experience acquired are applicable in multiple ways. Like, for example, there are graduates who finished masters in the DAP and did not went back to their country of origin, either Uganda, Somalia, or Ethiopia, but thought of coming up with refugee-led organizations and start giving back to the society through whatever they have learned. And there are those who went back to their country and participating in the rebuilding of their nations, like becoming government officials, like working with NGOs, and whatever skills they have, giving back to their society. The second thing I find out is that going back to homeland like Somalia, for most of my participants went back to Somalia, is a proper solution to all the youths, but also applying the knowledge, skills, and attitudes and experiences from BHER can be reused in the camps through forming community-based organizations who directly help the refugees with livelihood projects and request for budgets as normal NGOs do in the camps. Like, for example, there is an organization that this fellow graduates formed, which is called the DAP Response Association, that is giving back to the community by researching about whatever happening and giving, partnering with other NGOs to seek for solutions. There are 2 recommendations I came up with. The continuation of the program is a requirement, given that more youths are completing higher school now than in previous years, because previously few students could give the high grades required, but currently you will find 200 students getting B+ and above in the camps, This is something that needs an attention. Secondly, search for opportunities like online learning, like what Bad University, Osun Hub are doing to empower with the knowledge. There are more free online universities that includes the University of the People, which is free, and other short courses including computer skills, entrepreneurship skills, and other skills available in the camps, like electrical courses, plumbing, and hairdressing that given to the youths in the camp through NGOs like DRC provides, also plays a vital role in securing better business opportunities for the youths. I conclude, there are more chances for the learned youths to get sustaining jobs in their home countries as compared to those who are not gotten any tertiary education. Number two, the documentations are very important. Documents are very important when it comes to the employment fields. So youths in the camp should not only wait for resettlement, relocation, and repatriation processes, but also should focus on getting better education and moving their lives to another level. Building the body of the person is better than building the person from the brain. This is one thing I want to conclude. Education matures the person from the brain and they become critical thinkers. Thank you so much for this short presentation. Any question? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Abdi Kadir. Thank you so much, Alibacho. Now we're now opening fora for discussion, and this particular discussion is going to be led by none other than Mike Pala. Mike Pala is an associate director of refugee protection and in the Open Society Foundation from New York. Thank you. Mike Pala, it's your time. Please come up and guide us. We're going to have an opportunity to share. The panelists are there to share with us, and then we'll also have a forum where we are going to also discuss whatever we want. Thank you. Please, I think you have to come here so that they are able to see you. Thank you so much. Welcome.
All right, well, thank you so much to Osun and Kenyatta University for organizing this. I really wanted to start off by asking a question to our panelists about the presentations that we just heard, and I'll stand over here so others can see. And the first question is really about what, given the student expectations as described by Alibachu and the conclusions presented by Abubakar, should those developing curriculum and new programs for higher education for refugee students be taking into consideration the opportunities that are available after the degree programs? And if so, how should those conclusions or those considerations actually be incorporated into the program design? So I'll start there.
Thank you very much, because this is actually a question that came to my mind to address particularly to the last speaker, to the last presenter. We have students who complete their studies and want to go back to their country. And have they addressed the educational curriculum that the students receive in Kenya vis-a-vis the employment requirements in their own countries? Because one of the challenges we are having even here in Kenya is how to match products of our education system to the employment opportunities. So that's a question that I wanted to raise. I think in relation to the point you have raised, this is something that has to be addressed, how to make the postgraduate work they are getting here to what they will meet back in their own countries.
Thank you very much. That was very good presentations. And in my view, the two presenters really understands the scientific research in the manner in the way they have presented their work. As per whatever we are discussing, I also feel that the results will inform a lot the programming of interventions on refugee education. Maybe as prayers in the refugee context, we need to ask ourselves, when we provide tertiary education, when provide courses maybe in diploma and even in undergraduate courses, we need to think ahead, where do these people progress in their careers? As we have heard, you find that many of them, after graduating at the universities, they just go back to the camps and they are paid incentive wages. So there is need for more programming after taking a graduate course. How do you progress after that? It is good that some of them are going back to their own countries and they are getting employment. And this is quite satisfying because as their countries are rebuilding, you find that there is more employment that is being created. But it's unfortunate because there are still some others who still want to remain in the camps. Maybe Romiso and Abdikada, you can explain further why would some of them, even after acquiring their master's degree and their undergraduate courses, would want to remain in the camp and not explore other possibilities, like going back to their own country and get employment. And I was thinking about how do we ensure that these people progress even after their undergraduate courses. And I was thinking having some interventions like whatever Osun has already established, the research fellowships would be very important to build, their research careers. Somehow, maybe the prayers may also want to think on how we can have even maybe tutorial fellowships at the universities. But I know the greatest challenge would be funding. But even as the prayers in this field, the actors discuss about it, maybe that is one way to go. How we get these people who have their masters, how do they get their tutorial fellowships at the universities so that they can open even more doors for them. So in a nutshell, I would say that programming interventions after postgraduate studies and undergraduate studies would be very important.
I was particularly excited by the last point of the last presenter, where he touched on education, for life. Not because we are talking about education. And when we are talking about education, all the time we are talking about education and employment. What job am I going to get? But I don't think that education has really prepared students for life. Now, refugees are people who have had very challenging life experiences. And I just want to say I was particularly excited about that point, that when we think about education, we should not just think about education so that I go and get a job and earn money, but I should also think about education as something that prepares me for meaningful living, meaningful relationship with other people, and so on, the values of life. It was a very exciting recommendation he made at the end. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I realize we also have a panelist who's online, Professor Laura Hammond from SOAS University, and so I wanted to give her an opportunity also to respond to the question and share any initial reactions from the two presentations.
Some questions that maybe we could get into around precisely kind of following on from the last point about education being for life, and the need to think about how education prepares people for life. We also see in both of these presentations that there are obstacles to refugees taking advantage of the full training that education offers them, and particularly focusing on the issues around a lack of mobility post-graduation. And I really like Alibachu's kind of term of the agony of graduation and what all of that entails. So the lack of mobility and the lack of being able to access employment as well. And I remember when the new refugee proclamation came out in Ethiopia, there was quite a lot of excitement that somehow, I think a misunderstanding that people thought that it meant that all refugees would now have the right to work and to move outside of camps, and a much more inclusive policy. And it does include some important elements of greater inclusion, but it doesn't mean that all refugees have the right to move and the right to access work. And there are so many both structural, formal constraints as well as informal, societal kind of barriers to overcome in order to access employment markets that is really difficult. And both presentations also kind of mentioned the difficulty and the inadequacy of the so-called incentive scheme, which is actually a disincentive scheme for workers. The idea that you can take your degree and then go do a job that might pay you maybe 10% of what a national doing the same job would be paid is really insulting to, I think, these graduates. And it underscores the difficulties of being able to use your education within the camp setting in particular to its maximum benefit in a way. That there's really these constraints around not being able to really move much outside the camp and not being able to find adequate employment either inside or outside means that people are not able to really benefit from the full opportunities that an education should provide them with. So I lead something called the Research and Evidence Facility, which does work on migration in the Greater Horn of Africa, including in Kenya and in Ethiopia. And we've just finished doing some work looking at barriers to engaging more with the private sector for refugees, and particularly in Kakuma and Dadaab camps. And we see there that the lack of access to the right to move and the right to obtain work is really a huge impediment for refugees. And I think both of these presentations underscore that in really important ways. So I think it's important to talk about, one of the questions was just asked from the commentators about why people don't go back to their own country. And some people can and are lucky to be able to go back, at least for short periods of time, but not everyone can. And it's for a variety of reasons, not least of which is insecurity, return is not necessarily possible. So I think we need to think much more strongly about how to promote the futures of refugees in their host countries in more meaningful ways, and not expect that the kind of economic system of the camp will be enough to support them or for them to realize the potentials of their educations. So there are just some comments, and I apologize, I'm kind of going on a little bit because I do have to leave at the top of the hour for another meeting, so I'm not sure if I'll be able to speak again. But I really value these two presentations because they do shine a light into some of the clear, both the opportunities as well as some of the obstacles. And I guess maybe my question would be then, maybe to comment on that idea of how, it is or not possible, is it for refugees to really realize that potential of the education with the existing other constraints that exist around refugees from the host countries. So in Ethiopia, the terms of the 2019 proclamation, and in Kenya, the terms of the new Refugee Act. both their questions to ask around that and how it relates to education. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And I think that's a perfect segue to my next question, actually. Given the constraints on mobility, as well as the challenges associated with finding employment after completing an education program, a degree program, I'm curious to know from your perspective, what role do universities, your particular university, and then universities in general have in advocating for stronger policies that would either reduce these barriers to movement and or address the challenges associated with employment? How can universities play a larger role in the advocacy with their own governments and then thinking more broadly with other universities? Thanks.
I want to agree with many of our thoughts, even in various discussions, that the many governments, especially in Africa, they do not have policies for the refugees, despite the fact that there could be law that guide how they are treated and how they are progressed in the education system. But you find that the governments may not have provisions for the refugees in terms of the policies and the systems, and even the funding. They have not provided the funding for them. And this usually become a big challenge because the government argument is they are not able even to take care of their own, citizens' education. In actual fact, the government do cost sharing with the individual students on education. And therefore, because they do not have a provision for the refugee education, you find that a lot of advocacy may be required, on how the government program for the refugees. And in my opinion, I would think that the best way to involve the government in this is through research, and influencing the policy. So this brings a very critical and important maybe discussion that the actors need to engage in, the research part of it. The research on those issues that touches on the refugee education and even in other matters of employment so that we can influence. And we need to strengthen our advocacy, in the forums where the refugee issues are being discussed. The actors need to come out strongly and advocate for them. So I feel research would do much. If you could actually encourage and strengthen research hubs to do research on those areas that will provide a solution and influence the policy in the hosting governments.
Thanks. Dr. Dinga, would you like to respond?
Yeah, I really don't need to add to what you said. I think the government actually is interested in data. If there is data, then definitely action will be motivated. So sensitizing the government through research, I think she has explained it.
Thank you. And indeed, I think there's research in some countries that do show and demonstrate that refugees' participation in the economy contributes far greater than they take away. So more research of that nature in different contexts would be really helpful. So I want to now open it up to the audience for questions for either the panelists or for the presenters. And given maybe the limitations on mics, I can walk around and share the mic. First question.
Okay, thank you so much. I would like to say, great job, my dear fellow. That's your percent, a good job. I have just a question to ask as a refugee. Is it easy for the refugees who choose to go back to their home country of origins to get a job, since they don't hold the original document of their countries and they have the document from other refugee camps? Thank you.
Great. I think that question could go to either of the presenters. So does either one want to answer first?
Yes, I can try to answer that question. And thank you, Adam. And it is very easy for some, and it's also very difficult for others, because it depends on how you wish. You can go back to your country and decline the refugee status. Obviously, if UNHCR finds out, as Alibachi already mentioned, if UNHCR finds that you're going back to your country, then your status as a refugee will be declined. But there are other options that you can go and start working, because your home country, like for example in Somalia, there is no data check, and the country is still, struggling, and so it's easy for you to get your citizenship and start working. So that's what I can say in Somalia, but I don't know maybe in other countries like in Ethiopia or in Uganda or Burundi, Rwanda, and Tanzania.
Maybe from my study, I haven't come across any of my participants mentioning returning back to Eritrea or to Somalia. For all of them, their experience is to find employment in Ethiopia in a short term, or to pursue higher education in Ethiopia or abroad. Otherwise, I haven't come across none of my participants mentioning returning back to Somalia or to Eritrea. Yeah.
Thank you. And we'll have one question. Hello? Okay.
Okay, I'm Dr. David Otieno Ngira, Research Manager at Rift Valley Institute here in Nairobi. So my question, before joining the Institute, I worked as a lecturer teaching human rights. And so in that space, I interacted with a lot of refugees in different refugee forums. Now, one running thread in all those sessions, including a session we had last week at the Oxford Research Center based at the British Institute, is that a lot of refugees, much as they can now access higher education, they cannot still get registration with the professional bodies and accreditation bodies in Kenya, and I presume the same problem may be there in other countries too. So you come here and study as a teacher, you do Bachelor of Education at Kenyatta University, then you go to TSC and Teacher Service Commission tells you we don't register refugees as teachers. Then that means you can't practice as a teacher. You do law, you study law here, you go to Kenya School of Law, the government says, we don't admit refugees here. The lawyers, however, I think South Sudanese lawyers went to court 2 years ago, and now they can be admitted to train as lawyers, like in terms of the bar in Kenya. But I don't know about the other countries. Now, the same problem exists for accountants, for engineers, for doctors, and all these other registration bodies. So the question for researchers in this particular forum is, we are talking about access to higher education. Now the question is, after you access the higher education, you still have another administrative and regulatory barrier. How do we deal with that particular problem? Last month I was in South Sudan, and I met a student, a refugee student that I taught here in Kenya. I taught him law. Now back then, South Sudanese could not study at the Kenya School of Law. So you could do the bachelor's in law, but then you couldn't join the law school until this case came up last year. And the student told me, I was so frustrated in Kenya because I tried to join the School of Law, I couldn't. That means I can't be a lawyer in Kenya, and also then I can't be a lawyer in South Sudan. So I decided to come back to South Sudan. And now I got a job at the, Norwegian Refugee Council in South Sudan. But the question is, how do these administrative requirements that were not designed with refugees in mind act as a barrier to refugees using that very education? Because there is a lot of focus on the Refugee Act, but the Act doesn't deal with all these other administrative obstacles facing refugees.
Yeah, let's take maybe 2 more questions, and then we'll give it back to the panelists to respond, if that's okay.
Thank you, everyone. Yeah, my question is directed to my colleague who has just represented his research based on education as part of durable solution for refugees. Now, my question goes like this. Have you thought about those refugees who fled from their home countries with educational background of another language such as French. Let's say for a person who have fled from Democratic Republic of the Congo, they have graduated and they have their bachelor degrees here, but they are not recertified. So my question is just direct on recertification process. Have you thought about that when you are doing your research? Thank you.
Great. So we'll take one more question over here, and then we'll turn it back to the panelists.
Thank you so much. I want to first congratulate the presenters. They have done a very good job. They have really conquered some areas that were not very clear to me. But I would have really wanted to hear, and probably they will be able to tell us, whether the education that they have acquired and whether that particular education that they have acquired is applicable to their countries of origin. Because I remember one person said that they are not willing to go back. Probably the question is that this particular education that they have acquired elsewhere, is it relevant to the job market? And with that one, we can be able to answer so that at least we can be able to tell them that at home they will be employed. Number two of my question, and probably it's a suggestion that they can be able to take, is to do a tracer study to check on those students who have migrated and have gone back to their countries of origin, how they are performing. Because it can really inform them and tell them that those ones who have come, they are doing well or they are not doing well, the kind of challenges they are facing. And then with that one, we can be able to see how we can be able to sort it out. With the kind of education which is acquired, and I think some members who came before me, they mentioned it, that curriculum is to be able to see how it can be tailor-made to suit the needs of the countries. Because you find that probably if it is in Kenya or Ethiopia, when they go back to Somalia and other places, they may not really find it so useful. I'm not so sure, but I want, as they give us another presentation, to be able to see the relevance of that curriculum. What is it that can be changed so that at least the curriculum can make them useful to their countries? But finally, I want to say that I'm very excited. It is, they have done very well. They have conquered some areas of interest. Thank you so much. And my name is Kisi Lukombo, Dean School of Education, Kenyatta University.
Thank you very much. So to recap, we have three questions. One, focus on the administrative barriers to accessing some professional associations or networks. Two, related to opportunities for French language education. And three, looking at the relevance of degree programs in their home countries, and looking at, the suggestion was looking at how graduates perform in once they reach their home country, if they've gone back home. So I'll open it up again to both presenters as well as the panelists if you want to add anything. So I'll first leave it to the presenters.
Good. So shall I start, Abdulkader? Okay, thank you. Thank you for these wonderful questions, suggestions, and also some reflections, really, from your experiences. Well, direct to the questions, with regard to certification and also accreditation, which one of our colleagues raised. In the context of my study, where I focused on refugee graduates who passed through scholarship schemes and who studied only in public universities in Ethiopia. In that context, there are no issues with certification. I mean, they get the same type of degree that the nationals get, and they study in the same class, in the same courses, and as a result, there are no issues with certification from this process, from this particular process. But however, in some of the professions like law, for example, to aspire practicing law in Ethiopia, as I read from various literature, is in a way impossible for refugees. There are certain professions which are only for the nationals, and I see law also in that context. They can't do legal. They can join law schools, but then to practice law as a judge in the court and the like is only reserved for the nationals. And in that sense, I would understand this issue. Otherwise, certification from this particular process is not a big problem, and all of them have the same type of degrees. But then it makes very good sense with the other question, where refugees coming with degrees already from their countries of origin, sometimes degrees in a completely different language, like for example French. In that case, there are authorities, national authorities, who do this accreditation, but it's not easy really to go through these bureaucratic processes for various reasons. I mean, the bureaucracy itself is so clumsy, but at the same time, refugees are required to live in the camps, and these bureaucracies are located in the center, usually in Addis Ababa. So for various logistical, practical reasons, it is quite complex for refugees to go through these processes and to get their degrees accredited, particularly for refugees in the camps. I know, for example, refugees from the Great Lakes region who are in the western borders of Ethiopia in the Benshangul Gumuz region. So to travel back and forth for accreditation for someone with degree from somewhere in a French is logistically so really challenging, though there is a system, a difficult system also. Well, in terms of relevance of higher education degrees for refugees, I think this is a broader question that we can understand in the context of relevance of higher education for the nationals too, in terms of creating jobs, in terms of creating opportunities outside this employment in public service, particularly in Ethiopian context. Our education system is producing, thousands of, maybe millions of unemployed graduates. So it is a broader question, question of relevance. It is a question of quality of education that we have an issue as a nation. So they are joining this education system with the nationals. And I think they are also facing the consequences of this same education system. And therefore, this is an issue of broader relevance for the whole education system of the nation. But one important point that I would like to just mention is how refugees realize the potential of education, which Professor Laura emphasized. I think for refugees, and with all my participants, they really value education, and also they understand the potential of education. In fact, they also try to make whatever is possible out of this potential of education. I've seen, and I've included in my report also, several stories of refugees who are trying to use their education for good, to serve the community, and sometimes for temporary income generating activities, so that they can have some resources to pursue their long-term futures. So they are using the potential of education in a number of ways. I understand that higher education particularly has provided this pool of human resource for refugee communities in the refugee camps, who really work against the problems in the societies, in the refugee communities in the refugee camps. So I understand that refugees have very good sense of this potential of education, but this must be supported by system, and this must be really upgraded. Otherwise, individual refugees have very good sense of this potential of education. Thank you.
Just in addition to what Professor Albacho said, the education is very applicable for the graduates who go back and those who are still in the camps, as was asked, because the education in when the refugee youths are educated, it depends on how they apply that knowledge in their home country. For those who stay in the camps, they still think about like the number of students I met some are female and others are male. So they still think about, when you go back to your country, one thing you are asked before you get a job opportunity is a work experience. So they look for ways of creating a community-based, community-based activities, so that they get, working with communities on issues, like working with NGOs. So when they start building themselves, like for 1 year, that's the time they want to go back. And others, they also go back directly and start learning by working with people. So these are the only two ways the youths are thinking, and it is with my report that I wrote that. But the knowledge we are given, or the youths are given in the camps, is something that they all appreciated, and it's like it's opening, their mind. Like NGOs were giving, few NGOs were giving, aids like food, shelter, water, electricity. All those are essential things for life. But the other, consortiums that are coming to give education have done, better opportunities, because many, if we would have started opportunities like these higher educations before maybe 15 years, by now we would have, fewer youths in the camps. We would have built many countries. Like in Somalia, if you go to Somalia, you will find all the NGOs and the government officials. If you ask, you will find many youths are coming from the Dadaab. I'm coming from the Dadaab, I'm coming from the Dadaab. And this is one, things to acknowledge for Kenya, to support this, the host country, and also the NGOs to build these people to come back and give back to their country. So it's like we're giving, the country. If we would not have been educated, we would not have come back to our country and participate and see the importance of, development and the importance of government. And personally, I was only dealing with students who have finished York University. So I was looking at how that has impacted them. So I was not looking at any other, students, like the refugee students who are coming. I know they also face the same challenges, but I was not looking at that. Thank you.
Okay, so I got the indication that we're actually at time. So I'm sorry to cut it short. Thank you to our panelists, as well as our paper presenters. It was a really interesting discussion, and I look forward to the next panel. Thank you. Over to you, Dr. Rosemary.
Of time, we've not had a lot of opportunity to react, but we are so grateful to all of us who've been able to share their thoughts. And thank you, Mike Pella and your team, for the beautiful guidance that you've given us. You can now take your seats. We are very, very happy. Now, remember, we are asking ourselves, are there durable solutions to these graduates in the refugee world? And a lot of us have given a lot of insights. We are very, very grateful. So we want to say that in as much as the refugees have realized that there's a lot of potentiality in education, but the issue is when they finish, is the curriculum relevant enough for them to find something? Are the laws favoring them to enable them really go back to their countries and work? So that is with us. We don't need to be stressed about it, but we have to think about it and offer solutions. Now, I want to usher in the second panel. And this second panel, we're going to have it live. We have 3 of our fellows. We have Tacit. Yes, as she's coming. We have Sam Dennis. Sam Dennis, you must be somewhere beautiful. And then we have Akoko. Wow, lovely. So they are here with us, and therefore they're going to present what they have. And as they come in, we are changing just a little. We are swapping Sam with Tacit because the last group that has just presented, they had one advisor. That is Dr. Wiso, the Dean, School of Humanity, University of Maseno University, Kenya. He couldn't be here. This particular group, Tacit just come. So this particular group, of course, they have different advisors. I'll keep on mentioning as they come in, yes. And we have Tacit who is coming first. Tacit is an Ethiopian working in Somali. She's actually a PhD student in Addis Ababa University, studying linguistics. And she has 2 MAs. She has MA in journalism. She has MA in peace and security studies. She's really interested to just ensure that things work out well. So Tacit, it's your turn. And Tacit had a lovely advisor. We've all seen Laura Hamoud. So she requested, because she has another meeting, that she presents so that she's able to witness, and then she will log out. So you are welcome, Tacit. Tacit, you'll have to come here. The IT you can project for her.
Sure. So thank you very much, first of all, for the Osun Fellowship Program and for everyone who's here. It's a great pleasure to be part of this program and to have the opportunity to work with my lovely advisor, as has been stated by the program director. And yeah, my research is titled Human as a Bridge, and what I have tried to do with this research is to look into the relationship between the 2 communities that I try to be part of and that I'm part of. So this research basically is looking into how they characterize each other and how they have engaged and how their engagement have created, for now I am assuming a positive relationship, but this is the interest of the research. Next. So yeah, I mean, as a general rationale in the background is that I said, I am an Ethiopian, and for a lot of people might be, especially for Somalis, was something strange, because even for myself growing up, the way I have been told about Somalis and the relationship was...
Sorry for that interruption. We have the moderator, Shaharia. We have the panelists. We have Geoffrey. We have John Real. I don't know whether Dr. Kennedy Gitu is around. Okay. It's okay, I think. Sorry for that. You're welcome. Please take your seat so that we know you're the ones guiding us throughout the process. Thank you. Sorry for that interference. Thank you so much.
No problem. So as I was saying, so the rationale or the reason that I wanted to work on this topic is that my experience growing up, and it hasn't been a way of characterizing the Somali communities per se in a way that I could understand it at an early age, and I was curious, and I would say my experience was sort of characterizing them in a negative way, and this will come through the historical background later on, but even as a person growing in that circumstance, what I have been told or what I have been hearing was, well, Somalis are enemies of the Ethiopian state, and then they refer back to the wars that we have had, and immediately even there was slogans saying, Ethiopia take them, Somali to them, which is in Amharic, which means prosperity for Ethiopia and down for Somalia. And I was curious, how is this and why is this? So I did not want to just take it as it is, so I started from early days to look into this relationship in the communities. So, but that was not only my experience, and then if you have had read literatures, you'll be able to understand how that comes in. So that's why I wanted to work on why and how people characterization in general, but in this particular communities grow together or come into point. And for this, as I mentioned, we have this us in the other, and this is important because Somalis are not just Somalis living in Mogadishu or people in Somalia. In Ethiopia, we have an ethnic group, Somalis, who are Ethiopian themselves too. So there is this, when you consider me, when you say us, and then when you have the othering, this is really a bigger element in the relationship that we have had. So that's also an entry point. And then the backgrounds of the pre-colonial histories, where we have the expansionist modality of state building and the greater empire, Abyssinia, Habashi land, Ethiopia. These all are very instrumental elements in the why I wanted to do the research and the like. It will come in the process, and then you'll have the colonial time itself, where you will have a different characterization for Ethiopia, and then the other colonizers per se, and of course, religion interplays into these two communities, and it's a bigger pillar in the relationship and the migration there. So these are just entry points that I have tried to use for my research. Next, please. So in general, as I said, the general objective of the research is to understand this relationship or this thing by engaging with the people who actually live among these communities, so the two different communities, which means to see the engagement or the relationship of Ethiopians living in Somali communities and Somalis who have got the chance to live among Ethiopian communities, so that I can be able to use their voices or their experiences and see whether it is building into a positive relation or how is it going and working out. So specifically, so initially I was intending to do in-depth interview with 7 to 10 people as by using it as a focused one, but later on I have got the chance to engage with more people. But then this is the way that I wanted to see, and I wanted to see this through the people living in the borderland. In borderland, in this circumstance also, the Ethiopian Somali regional state itself as an embodiment of region, and then also the people within it are part of the major conversation, and then understand the day-to-day decision-making they have come across in the living in these communities. And I was hoping, or what I wanted is to see these stories or their experiences and see or look at it from the bigger regional, whether it's regional integration, community relation, or developing together. As a methodology, as it is focused, so I used qualitative research methods, and I have acquired an ethical clearance from one of my universities, from Jigjiga University, and I have used purposive sampling, as I said, because I was interested to see the encounter of people who have got the chance to live or to get informed through these experiences. And of course, I've gone through the literature in such a manner. And by the end, I have had 23 participants, which I had individual interviews plus 2 focus group discussions. Mainly the focus group discussion was among young people, the young Ethiopians, and young Somalilanders specifically. For the data gathering, I have used 3 languages, sometimes with the help of translators, because I have spoken Ethiopian, so I speak Amharic, and then I have Somalis who I can speak a bit of it, but for certainty that I had to have support with, and of course English for those who can speak English. So yeah, and some of the poetic expressions, because these poets in Somali community especially, people in the oral community are the ones who are powerful for the message and perception of community, so I've used 2 of those. And the data was presented as a thematically categorized under this. Next, please. Well, I wouldn't go too deep into this, but as I said, in reviewing the literature, the majority of conversation is the region itself and the conflicts it had. I mean, everybody knows about the Horn of Africa and how conflict-driven or how it has been ravaged by the conflict, and specifically these communities like Ethiopian and Somalis, they have had a war encounter in many circumstances. So that's a very important element to understand. And of course, then it comes to the Somaliland, and 3 Somali nations within this characterization. And the element of Abyssinia and who's Habesha, which is another important term. I mean, Habesha is a kind of a word which is very important in the history of Ethiopians. And sometimes people use it as a regional even, which mainly the Somalis use to refer or reference to Ethiopians. This comes into even in the Quran, it is stated, you'll find this word as a depiction of the community in many instrumental tools, but it interplays into the history of the community a lot. Yes, and I also look into the Muslim, the first Hijra, because it plays into how the word Habashi is used. Because in the Islamic context, where in my research, I had 2 religious leaders who were part of the in-depth interview. So what they have tried to depict for me is Habashi. Whenever they hear the word Habesha, they say, I immediately think of Bilal al-Habashi, which is beyond everybody's, it's not a specific ethnic, but it could connect to a lot of people. And then al-Najashi, who was the king who received the first migrant. So you will see the difference between religious domain, communities in such a way. So it's important to understand that. And then the colonial history, as I said, the pre-colonial history, both, I mean, the assumed Ethiopian state and then the Muslim pushing powers into interlands of Ethiopia have a bigger element of understanding how people describe or characterize themselves, because this has sovereignty, territoriality, and relationship. In this one, and then of course we went to a war several times because of this. And then in general, the literature, if you read it, they say it was more of the animosity, the negative relation that you will see among them, and the suspicion, especially on the suspicion, I will say, for the Somali Ethiopians. Now they are part of Ethiopia, but then they are looked in a different lens, and their engagement was limited or characterized in such a domain, which kind of interplays into how they see themselves with the state, how they see themselves in connection to the communities across the border, whichever border drawing you have, and engagement among themselves per se. And then also the perception of, in general, the way of life of the communities, because the defaulted Ethiopia has settlement, state structure, and sedentary way of life, while for the Somalis, this is a nomadic way of life, which has been characterized in different ways, which is limiting and increase interpretational differences. So these are some of the major literature reviews and entry points which are used as an analysis for the data that I have found. Next, please. Well, and then this is kind of the thing that I have taken through the answers to. So the Somali, the person and the nations. So as I said, the nations now, the person individually goes with the description or characterization, as I mentioned. You will be told, like in a Somali, is as a person who is just randomly moving from place to places. And this is a characterization that you will hear from people from the Ethiopian side, because the defaulted Ethiopian is settlement, agriculturalist states that have had 3,000 years of history. So this is how the respondents kind of characterize Somali as a person. And also, I mean, one of the, as I said, religion plays a bigger role in the relationship between the two countries. But then in Ethiopian context, or from the Ethiopians, the response was, oh, these are the people who bit in the hand that fed them. And they're trying to go back to the first migration, the Hijra, where Ethiopia has received them as a guest, but now they say they are acting like people who are the owner of the land. So that's some characterization that you have in the relationship. And of course, threat to the national sovereignty. These Somali communities being living in the border between the other Somali states, be it Somalia, Mogadishu, be it Somaliland in the northern Somalia, they considered people who cannot be trusted in terms of defense. And they used a reference of the 1977 war between Ethiopia and Somalia, which is called the Karamara War, where the Somalis in the Ethiopian Somalis participated in the war and then more supported the other side. So this is the perception and characterization they have. Somehow, and also the wording itself, Ethiopian Somalis, or Somalis in Ethiopia. You would not find any other ethnic groups in Ethiopia which had to have this suffix or connection to their names so that it could portray or depict who they are. So this is something Somalis themselves also wanted to fight back, and especially the recent or the new president of the region has voiced this, and he made sure the name of the regional state has to be changed. Previously, it used to be called the Ethiopian Somali Regional State, but now it is the Somali Regional State of Ethiopia. So these are interplayed in the relation. Next, please. Well, I'm running into this, and it's a lot of, you can understand how many things that has to be there, but I'm just picking the highlights of this. When you look into the Ethiopia and Ethiopians, especially the entry point will be Habashi. When I first moved my first entry was going to the Ethiopian Somali region. I myself have a bias still. I keep calling it Ethiopian Somali Regional State. But when I went to Jujuga University, they will ask me, Habashi Batahai, are you a Habasha? And I say, aren't you guys a Habasha too? So this is within Ethiopian Somali region. But then also the same thing happened when I moved to Somaliland. And they will say, Habashi Batahai. Yes, I am. Are you a Habasha that's in Somalia? And I say, yes, I'm an Ethiopian. No. Are you this and that? Even there is a cascade for who is an Ethiopian or who is a Habashi. So Habashi does not only brings everyone in Ethiopia a shield. It's not only a Somali's perspective, actually. Even other ethnic groups in Ethiopia have this connection to the word and it portrays. Because Habasha, I would say with a bias, it talks about the highlanders or the Amhara, Tigrayans, Eritreans per se. So this has become a default, and then the Somalis will see you in such a way, and this is the first encounter. So the primary understanding or the major response they have had was, why, these are the highlanders. These are anyone who is not a Somali. If you're not an ethnic Somali, primarily they will say us and them. But then the religious, as I said before, for the religious leaders, they kind of try to tell you it should be inclusive of everyone. And even the Encyclopedia of Islam, when it puts Habashi, it kind of broadens it, saying people in the Horn. So that's the kind of connection they want to make. But I mean, it's among few religious points. As I said, it's Bilal and Najashi. When, again, it's about Christianity, which is incompatible to being a Somali, even if you're an Ethiopian Somali. And of course, the Amhara, the Tigrayans, sometimes including the Eritreans. Well, as an individual, they will say merciless, someone who is always taking somebody's place, land, and this is the words that actually came from the conversation among the Somali respondents. Next. Well, in a nutshell, then, what came out of this research, I would say, is that history has interplayed a lot in the relationship of these two communities, especially the war, and that sort of relationship have helped in the negative, but at the same time, because of this wars, migration happened. So these are the elements that changed it in how movement, especially migration, become a part of the relationship, positive relationship building, I would say. And that's where I wanted to focus, saying human as a bridge. These people, for different reasons, were moving among each other, but that has become another entry point for a quote-unquote to know each other. I wouldn't put it as a totally positive, but at least give them the chance to know each other. So in 1977 was what happened between Ethiopians. The first move was Ethiopian Somalis moving to Somalia, and then this became a first engagement and a kind of relation with the Ethiopians. And in 1988 actually is different because the northern Somali community moved to Ethiopia, and they were given a base, especially the SNM, which is the Somaliland National Movement, which reclaimed for the re-independence of Somaliland. They were given the base, and they were engaged with the community. So they were able to actually see Ethiopians or engage with Ethiopians as an individual or a human level. So one of the, even the reason that I started to work on this one was a conversation with a guy called Said Habashi. He's a Somali, but who was imprisoned in one of the notorious prisons in Ethiopia during the Derg time. And because he was so connected, integrated with the Ethiopians, he was given the name Said Habashi. And the way he describes this relationship, imagine he was arrested for being in that place in the wrong time. He has not done anything. But he kind of has embraced it and then say, like, with all the problems that I have faced in the prison, this is the chance that I got to meet Ethiopians as an individual, as a person, rather than this state-centric conversation and describing each other. So what he was like, people used to ask me, Habashi May, which in Somali means, where are the Habesha people? Where are the people? Because for them, there has to be cruel people who are gonna kind of treat you in a bad way, even when you arrive at the airport. So this is a kind, him and his likes are people who came back and kind of gave information to the younger generation. And among the conversation of the young people that I have had, so they say, no, now we know Ethiopia different. Still there are a lot of negativities, but at least the conversation or the experience, the migrants who brought back after 1991, when Somaliland secured its re-independence, as a completely different narration. It paved a little bit of positive connection between the two. And then of course, now Ethiopia provides scholarship to Somalis in general. So when they come and get the education, they get the chance to see the culture, embrace it, and understand, and then portray the differences. Next, please. Well, this also in terms of the Somalis, as I said, it's changing, but then the change is different from 3 places. Because now the ethnicity Somali cross not only for the Ethiopia, but you have it in Djibouti, you have it in Kenya. So these are communities, when you say the word Somali, it is 3-layered. You're talking about the person, you're talking about a state, and you're talking about also the language. So it depends on how people could interpret it. But in any ways, the Somali, in this particular case, I'm referring to Somali Mogadishu, or the proper Somali, if you want to call it, the way this changing relationship, even though the migration has happened, it's not, the respondents from this conversation do not have this positive changes coming. We understand each other in the same way, because after the 90s, 2006, Ethiopian government engaged in an intervention called Fight the Extremists. So this still kind of was seen as an intruder into others' business. Ethiopians are people who intrude into others' business and structure, so it still is not in a way of helpful narration. And the reason that I have put these flags is there is still tension or contest. Like the first one is a flag of Somaliland, the de facto state, which is kind of trying to use this monumental 5-pointed star, which is symbolic to Greater Somalia, but they have placed it in a black spot saying there is no going back. So this is another relationship between Ethiopians, Somalis, Somalilanders. And the second one is the proper Somalia, or the Somalia Mogadishu, who still have they don't still have the territorial claim, but this is something people consider might happen at some point, and the suspicion of Ethiopians thinking Somalis are not loyal enough is still pointed in that. The last one is a recent change in Somali regional state. And previously it had a camel, but now it has brought the 5-star. So when people look at this, they still interplay into the relationships. Next, please. I have said this a lot, so I'm not going to go in details of this, but so this is how it's different for Somaliland. Now, as I said, for Somaliland, they were hosted as a refugee, even though the Mogadishans are also hosted as a refugee, but then it's a completely different assistance. And then Ethiopia was the first country who opened a diplomatic mission in Somaliland. That is another positive message for the community. Ethiopia, there is this Admas University, which was the first private university opened in Somaliland. So these all, and then you have restaurants, barber shops, which actually is not only the state relationship, but human-to-human relation changing. One simple example is one of my respondents, the young respondent was saying, I don't go anymore to the Somali barbers. Not that Somalis are not a good barber, but he says the Ethiopians are more professional into the service provision in such a way. So they are learning. Teachers are characterized in such a way too. So yeah, it's changing, and it's a lot of positivity in terms of great engagement here. The next one. Well, I know I've said a lot of things all over the places, but what I see is in the past, even the present, is still complex, but there are elements which are helping the community in understanding each other, and I will still emphasize migration or movement as one of the key enablers or tools that are helping the human-to-human relations. And national policies have usually been more of political oriented in just like many places. So maybe looking into soft engagements or soft relation and this development oriented human-centric approach will change the relationship and then will bring positivity. And for the Ethiopian Somalis, what happened is before they used to, as I said, they will portray themselves as and them. And one of the key elements in this was power sharing. So now we have 5 high political figures of Somalis who are leaders in the country system. The first one is the vice president for the major party, and he's considered to be now not only Ethiopian Somalis, but the other Somalis also kind of say, now we see integrated, or people, the Ethiopian Somalis taking as part of Ethiopian diverse communities, like the 18 nationalities they are in. The regional president's an important and a key figure in that element. And yeah, I mean, what I would say at the end, and what I have learned, if any learning from this research, is people are finding more stories to connect themselves with, and this is helped or is able by the meeting of each other, and this way it could, and that's why I call them humans are the bridge in this change and development. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Can we give a round of applause? Thank you so much. I want to thank you for that beautiful presentation. Please just sit close to the panelists. I want to invite Sam Dennis, and I want to appeal to you and Akoko, who is coming next, that please let us use the 15 minutes, because otherwise then we will not finish. Sam Dennis is a doctoral student of literature in the University of Nairobi, and he's interested in Indian Ocean researches, literature, pandemics, population literature, popular literature and culture, and he lives in Nairobi. He has the advisor who is called Dr. Majid Ambrena. Ambrena is actually a professor of land law and development, School of Law and Politics, Cardiff University. Sam, you're welcome. Sam is always a pace setter, and I know he's going to take less than 15 minutes. Sam, you're welcome. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much. I don't know if that's a trap, but anyway, let's hope that we'll keep to the time. So my research, what I was working on for this fellowship, is called Mosaics of Belonging. I hope they'll be able to project it. an oral history of the South Asian presence in Kenya. Now, we are gathered here, yeah, that one. So I tried looking for a picture of a mosaic. So we are gathered here talking about belonging. And one of the questions that I asked myself when I was doing this research was, who belongs and what are the limits of belonging? And just go to the next slide, please. So who belongs and what are the limits of belonging? Because I think we've heard of the South Sudanese who are refugees in Kenya. Some of them have law degrees, but they can't be considered as advocates. We also have the teachers who can't be registered. So who belongs and what are the limits of belonging? So the desire to belong is a need that has been deeply embedded in the human DNA, where people constantly seek to belong in some places. And so this need to belong to a better place leads to things like immigration, and which is as old as humanity itself. And with migration and even immigration comes conflicts, because that means resources which are quite limited, people want to fight for them. So yeah, so now one of the things that, I mean, how do we understand the question of belonging? Because I ask myself, how have these tales been twisted by those who wield power? These are some of the fundamental questions that this presentation addresses. The next slide, please. Now, I think I really liked the idea of oral histories because it gave me a chance to contest perceived notions. And I approached this research from the point that oral histories have been neglected, and more so the oral histories of the South Asian community. And this leads to some sort of erasure. Yeah? We are losing some archives, both human and material, because if we don't talk about them, if we don't research about them, then those who have access to this information, once they leave the stage, then that information is gone. So next slide, please. Now, I talked to 3 South Asians who represent different demographic backgrounds. The first one was Madhukant Shah, the other one was Zarina Patel, and the last one was Shiraz Durrani. And with Madhukant, he is the proprietor. He was the proprietor of Harrier's Stamp Shop, and this is one of the oldest shops in Nairobi. And with it, it's not just a shop. With it comes a history that speaks of the South Asian community in Kenya, as we will see as we move along. Zarina Patel also is one of the leading South Asian intellectuals in Kenya, and she gave me access to the pre-colonial and even colonial history of the South Asian community in Kenya. Now, with Shiraz Durrani, it was the whole idea of justice, because if we speak about an injustice being committed against, being meted against the South Asian community by, let me call them the natives, is that justice? Yeah, I mean, right now there is the conflict between Israel and Palestine, pitting different people on different divides. So there are people who believe that Israel are the right owners of Palestine. I mean, it's a quite an emotive debate. So South Asian intellectualism and even activism. Next slide. Yeah, so one of the things I found fascinating during my literature review was on the historical question of the South Asian community. And Bethel Ogot, that's why I put him, Ogot versus Patel, on South Asian interests in East Africa, a colony or not. Now, Bethel Ogot is one of the most, he's a leading historian of Africa and even Kenya. And in his book, Zamani, he says that India wanted East Africa as a colony. Yeah, so this is something that I found quite fascinating, because talking to Zarina Patel herself, she tells me, how could India have wanted to colonize Kenya, yet India itself was a colony of the same empire? And I found that quite interesting that, I mean, a historian misrepresenting historical facts. And when I was trying to look it up, no one has challenged this perception of the South Asian community in Kenya. So that is what I found to be interesting. And more so, I mean, we all know the history of Indians in Kenya. Some came because of trade, some as laborers along the Lunatic Express. And now, I mean, the racial relations and the need for power, the British, the South Asians, and the Africans at the cusp of independence. Now this takes us now also to the historical question where when the British wanted to leave, they came up with the Devonshire White Paper, which stipulated the paramountcy of the African, and that left the South Asians in the middle. Because now the question came in, what do we do? One of the things I was writing down is, what do we do with them? And with them in this case refers to the South Asians, because the British were leaving. They were not leaving power to the South Asians. And reason being, the South Asians represented an Oriental bloc, while the British represented the Western bloc. And remember, before then, they had set up institutions where they had educated Kenyans and also, in a way, colonized them to the ways of the British. So they left power to the Kenyans. And now this now brought in now the racial tensions at the cusp of independence. Next slide, please. Yeah, so now this brings us now to the question of South Asian citizenship and belonging in now post-colonial Kenya, and this is now is in independence Kenya. And I talk about Mathukan Shah as a witness. I refer to him and Harry as Stamp Shop. Now, talking to him, Harry as Stamp Shop has been there since, I think, since Kenya was a protectorate. Started off as a stamp shop, later on became an apparel shop selling kangas, which also speaks of the Kenyan relations to the to India. Yeah, so the shop survived the Africanization policy where Mathukan Shah, as a witness of this violence against the Asian, would tell me that his father, who was a doctor to Joseph Morombi, he was then vice president of Kenya, and he was also half Asian. Their license, the shop license, was revoked by the Kenyatta administration. Yeah, that's the slide. Yeah, the Kenyatta administration. And when they wanted the license back, they had to go through Joseph Morombi for the license to be returned. And now, this is just a backdrop of what was happening in East Africa. Yeah, Obote brought in the Common Man's Charter, Idi Amin expelling the South Asians in 1972. These are quite well-documented historical facts. Nyerere and also the Ujamaa policy, which was also, in a way, a move to disenfranchise the South Asians who now occupied the middle. Jomo Kenyatta and the Africanization policy, which led now to the withdrawal of Asian licenses, and most of them took up British citizenship. And I think that's how, even in East Africa itself, I mean, we have Goodna, who was also a victim of this violence against the South Asians in Tanzania. The current minister for, Immigration and Foreign Affairs in Britain, she is a daughter of immigrants. The Kenyan, I think, is a deputy ambassador, Kenyan deputy ambassador to, the Canadian deputy ambassador to Kenya, is also a child of immigrants who moved from Kenya to Canada. So we see these effects of these kinds of policies against the South Asians. Next slide. And I think even as we think about Yash Palgai, I think when I was doing my research, I think he would give us, I didn't have the chance to interview him, but he would give us a panoramic view of these tensions in East Africa, because Yash Palgai was in Tanzania at some point, yeah, and he was also denied practicing rights as a scholar and even as a lawyer in Tanzania. Now, when he came to Kenya, Charles Njonjo at the time was also leading against disenfranchising Yash Palgai as a constitutionalist and even a legal scholar. And I talk about Farouz Noroji and even Yusuf Dawood, who are now, in a way, let me call them the creme de la creme. Of course, there are more of the South Asians in Kenya. Now, the assassination of Pinto in 1965, which is also the end, not just of a person, but the end of an ideology. Because remember, Pinto was leaning towards the socialism. So when he was killed, that is not just the end of a person, but also the end of an ideology whose effects are still being felt to date. We talk about the economic presence in post-independence Kenya, and that's why I think Mathukan Shah was now letting me into now the histories of the South Asians. Now, when the licenses for the shops were being withdrawn, most of them went into now industries, and that's how we have some of the leading industries in Kenya actually are owned by the South Asian community, and this speaks to the resilience of the community in Kenya. Next slide. So when we talk even about the title of labor unionizations, when we had, I think I was talking to Zarina Patel, and one of the questions I asked her is, do we have labor unions in Kenya right now? And she told me outrightly, no. Because if you look at what Makan Singh and even Manilal Desai had done with regard to creating a labor union in Kenya, and the impact of the labor unions in Kenya in just slightly before and slightly after independence, you can't compare it to what has happened now. So we have this erasure of people, erasure of histories, erasure of movements that came in with the expulsion and even the disenfranchisement of the South Asians. Now, one of the things to realize is that the experiences of the South Asians in Kenya have been anything but one-dimensional and static. Now, we can't look at them as, because definitely, and I think one of the things you realize is, as an outsider looking in, we have notions that this is just one community that engages in one practice. But then once you start asking yourself these questions, you realize that the different, even though it is a South Asian community in terms of the region they came from, they engage in different practices, different religions, different beliefs. Now, history evolves, and that's the need for oral histories, because oral histories give us an entry point. I mean, how do we ask old questions from a contemporary point? Because I think asking this question of Kenya as a colony today, if I had not asked that question, I would have probably believed what God says to be true. So personal positions may not necessarily be the truth. Bias privileges the powerful, and there's this quote that's ascribed to Achebe: until the lions learn to tell their tales, praise will always be upon the hunter. So, I mean, God had it that Asians wanted Kenya and East Africa as a colony, but as we've seen, that's not quite true. Different social standings provide different access to varied access to historical information. Mathukan Shah was a businessman, and through his shop, you see how the economic effects on the Asian community in Kenya. Zarina Patel is an intellectual and also an activist, and through her we see the contributions of Asians to not just pre-colonial Kenya, but even Kenya today, because right now she is involved in the restoration of the Jivanji Gardens. If you go walk past Jivanji Gardens in town, you'll see that it's actually being renovated, and she is also the granddaughter of Alibhai Mullah Jivanji. I mean, activists and even public intellectuals, when I was talking to Shiraz Durrani, and that's why the idea of justice came in. How do we look at justice? I think, Mahmoud Mamdani, in Neither Settler Nor Native, he talks about nationalism and colonialism being two sides of the same coin. As Africans, there were some instances where we complained about the colonial legacies and how we were disenfranchised by colonialism. But now, when we became nationalists, how have we been disenfranchising others who are neither settlers nor natives in the lands the British left us? Next slide. Yeah, so, I mean, what will the future look like? What will place mean to the different people who live in it? Will we be more embracing of those who occupy the spaces we think originally belonged to us? Will racial tensions between the two communities still persist? Because there is that notion that the Asians and the Africans, there is some elements of racial tension. So will they persist? So the question I ask myself is, will I go back to my title? Will the mosaic hold the different people we have? Yeah. Next slide. Yeah, the end. So I've kept time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sam. You can take your seat. And just like I mentioned, it took exactly 15 minutes. I think that is lovely. I want to request Jacob Akoko to come. Jacob Akoko is in the Faculty of Humanity. He actually teaches politics in the Department of History, Archaeology, and Political Studies in KU. And he is one of our fellows. He's welcome. He's had Dr. Sharath, who is here. Dr. Sharath, you're seated somewhere? Yeah, right at the back. Dr. Sharath is actually co-director of the University of Cambridge Center of Government and Human Rights. David and Ellen Potter, Associate Professor, and is the one who's been guiding him. So we are privileged to have Akoko with us. Please let's have up the slide so that he's able to start. Akoko, I'm giving you 15 minutes, and I know you'll make it. So feel welcome. Thank you.
Is it loud? So Sam Dennis has made a serious charge against the venerable historian Bethwel Ogot. I come from the department where Bethwel Ogot is a pioneer teacher, and I want just to tell Sam Dennis that please take time, go to the National Archive and visit the National Archive and look for the file on the Kenyan National Congress, the counterpart of the Indian National Congress. Just to give you a flavor of what one of the leaders of the Indian National Congress had to say in Nairobi 1924 is this, and this is Mrs. Sarojini Naidu, a key leader in the Indian National Congress. This is what she had to say. I dare any man of any nation to challenge the statement of the traditional, that this is the traditional colony of the Indian people. It does not take a very learned students to realize that naturally and inevitably East Africa is one of the earliest and legitimate colonial territories of the Indian nation. I stand today to speak on an Indian land. That was a serious charge and the tension that there was between the Indian Congress and all the African national movements, both in Tanzania and Kenya. So let me come to my paper. I'm more interested in what today is called the Kenya Social Justice Movement, or centers. So these centers, in this paper, or in this research, I've wanted to find out a number of things, guided by the following questions. What is a social justice center? What, if any, has been the impact of the establishment of the centers on the dominant practices of human rights activism and practices? Again, what has been the impact of these centers on the communities that host them? So what do these centers tell us about the usefulness of academic theories that critique the concept of civil society as Eurocentric? So let me just say that Kenya has had a very vibrant human rights democracy movement scene, especially from 1990 on. And what has come to characterize Kenyan human rights scene is the establishment of the dominant form of human rights activism. These that borrows their practices, these that are funded by international human rights organizations such as the Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International. And so the characteristics that is coming out is that you have a clear class divide between the middle class-led, upmarket-based human rights organizations and the more recent ones that have been established in the economically and politically marginalized parts of the city, the slums of Nairobi, the slums of Kisumu. By establishing these kinds of human rights organizations, I say that they've symbolically and substantively challenged the dominant practice of human rights as we knew it in the last couple of years. And so I set out to find out what exactly are the human rights organizations, what are their concerns, what's their programs, how do they relate with the bigger brothers who have more funding, have more expertise, and what does this mean for the struggle at the same time that they say is based on the Kenyan Constitution 2010. So one of the respondents told me that perhaps Well, if you look at the story of the human rights of the emergence of social justice movements, then it's intricately interwoven with the biography of one of the leading establishers of the Mathare social justice movement. This is Gasheke Gashihi, who tells me his long history of having been displaced in the Rift Valley by the 1990s political violence, which more instigated against those who were imagined to be opposition members or supporters of opposition parties. As a result of that, Gasheke Gashihi found himself in the slums of Nairobi, Kiamaiko, part of Mathare in particular. He washed cars, but in between washing cars, he also dabbled in grassroots politics and dabbled in the human rights movements that were championing political reforms, such as the National Convention Executive Council, NCC, which was led by the likes of Professor Kivuta Kibwana, Dr. Willy Mutunga, and a host of others. So as a result of this, Gasheke then veered off and found work for a number of what they call the human rights funding, the human rights organizations that document, monitor, report, and fund strategic litigations or certain cases of human rights work violations. And so this is what he says of his experience at about 2013, that after having worked for some time in these organizations, he got fatigued. He says, you see, you report fresh early in the morning. We document extrajudicial killings. The majority of them come from Kiamaiko, Huruma, Mathare. We send the reports to Geneva, reports on gross human rights abuses, and then after 1 year, we begin the process again. We can take like 20 cases, but only 5 will make it to public litigation. So I veered off, spent some time in Bunge la Mwananchi. Here, there was no contractual obligation. Then I thought about establishing a permanent place. I thought of a social justice center. It was difficult to organize from Jivanji Gardens, where Bunge la Mwananchi was, because Bunge la Mwananchi was an open public space for public debates, but was easily infiltrated by state agents, and Gasheke thought that there's no way this kind of space was going to give the urban poor a way of addressing the problems we're facing. So his friend Onyangolo, I think the only Kenyan who I've met, the late Onyangolo, the only Kenyan who I've met who was a self-confessed Marxist-Leninist, advised him to establish a center to get a community anchorage for his work. And so he says, we established an office in Mathare. The community here opposed us. They said we are opposing government. But the work we do terrifies those who oppress us. The police now respect us. They do not arrest us ovyo. We now have agency here at the grassroots. And here, the director is Otmaina Kiai. And it has sparked conversations that the kind of conversations we want. We have created a path. Our problem now is how do we consolidate it. In a sense, then, Gasheke gives us a critique of the established human rights organizations, the dominant ones. They had become too bureaucratized, too professionalized, too preoccupied with injuries of individuals to pay attention to the structural aspects that make these individuals vulnerable to human rights violations. So he says ordinary people then must own their struggle if they're going to make a difference. That kind of critique is a kind of critique again he shares with Dr. Willy Mutunga, who also says that around 2016, 2015, most of the human rights organizations were now being supplanted by new ones. There were, the old ones had become bereft of vision, passion, and by and large become too professionalized. So the social justice movement then moved to try and address these problems and bring back activism to human rights and connect faces to the statistics that organizations such as Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International routinely report, and connect them to communities then that can use these reports for their struggle. So for them, their approach had to be different. Unlike the middle class-led NGO movements that had championed reforms in the 90s all the way to 2010, thereabouts, which culminated in the enactment of Constitution of Kenya 2010, which had more like taken that approach of a cuckoo bird, that as intellectuals they could come and lay their intellectual radical ideas in the nest of a populist politician or a charismatic politician, and then hope that via that mechanism they'd harvest reforms. This social justice center said that they're going to educate the communities where they live in, they're going to cultivate relationship with these communities, and on the basis of that, then wage a struggle that will now have the struggle for socio-economic rights at the forefront of their struggle, not civil political rights, which had been championed by the old, well-established NGOs. Their experience so far in this kind of struggle has been interesting. They've been able to collaborate fairly well with the established human rights organizations on issues such as sexual gender-based violence, issues such as containing political violence. But wherever they take, like they did last week on the 17th, to champion and advocate for the implementation of Article 43 of Kenya's Constitution, which is the article that addresses socioeconomic rights, then these human rights organizations have been reluctant or only come in, as one of them say, they only come in because they need something to report. So they come in to bail us out because we will give them the statistics to report at the end of the day that some work is being done in human rights sense. But in terms of championing and asking us, then why is this thing not being addressed, then this is not happening. So this movement too has been successful in advocating against extrajudicial killing or police execution of urban poor youths. As one of them, respondents told me, they used to kill as many as 5 to 6 youths daily here in Mathare. They still kill young men, but now they kill one on a weekly basis. No one cared to investigate the issues behind the bullets. Sometimes the issues of personal vendetta, conflict between the policeman and the victim, but the young men were always stigmatized as criminals. This affected everyone. Killing was normalized. We know this is not a struggle between us and the police. It is a war of poverty. So as a result of this now, they've formed the Mothers of Victims and Survivors, a vibrant community of mothers who've lost sons, those who've lost husbands, to police execution. Kenyans would remember this viral video of one Rashid pulling out a youth before Mlango Kubwa and executing him in broad daylight. Now the police now, he says, have stopped doing that kind of thing. They just strangle the youths. But the pressure is on, and this pressure then seems to have given the community a bit of a relief. So this kind of activism then has also put them at loggerheads with the constitutionally established human rights commissions. And Chapter 15 of Kenya's Constitution provides for quite a number of them: Commission on Administration of Justice, Independent Police Oversight Authority, the Gender and Equality Commission. There are a whole host of commissions that are established by this. But this then is the experience in working with these institutions. They say the commissions are either too infiltrated by government agents, they sell out, they have informants, they are too bureaucratic and take too long to act on our cases. The charge then that this independent commission make against them is that they too are too reckless and are too quick to take to the social media. So what are the challenges these institutions are facing? Well, they say the first 2 years when they began, things were good. But now donor money is coming. And these tensions over donor money and divisions of how that can be used. They say They've partnered, yes, with international groups such as the Amnesty International, but wherever they attend events at the well-ventilated and manicured lawns in the United Nations and other places, they get subtle reminder that that slogan that they like, such as social justice, such as forward with socialism, forward revolution with forward, is not very welcome in those setups. They are subtly reminded, and they've taken now to saying forward with social justice movement, forward with social justice movement. And wherever then they articulate their issues that we want rent to be reduced, we want food on the table, we want, their partners tell them, why don't you talk about tekeleza katiba? Why don't you talk about implement katiba? In other words, they are taken back to a very ambivalent and an ambivalent interpretation of what the Constitution demands they are making. So in a sense, those are the social justice movement, a picture of what is going on within the human rights contestation and circles. But this then raises a number of questions for academics as well. What if for a moment we take it, as James Ferguson says, that politics is not just about what you oppose, but what you want? What if, as Professor Isha Shivji says, constitutions do not make revolution. Revolutions make constitutions. Then of what good is human rights politics? We leave it there.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, and sorry for rushing you up. We appreciate. Thanks for the wonderful presentation. I know we are, it's 1 something, but I'll request for your indulgence. Let's give them a few more minutes so that we have the panel. And Akoko, please sit with your team. I want to request our moderator, that is Professor Shaharia Sadat, to come in. He is, of course, the Director, Academic and Legal Empowerment, Center for Peace and Justice, BRAC University. In fact, as they were talking, I was saying, this fellowship has such diverse topics, but because you also have a multidisciplinary team, we don't need to fear, because there'll be people to guide us. Sharath, you're welcome, and take the podium to take this.
Hi, good afternoon. May I request all of you to stand up for 1 minute? Yes, I think you know, I'm very much mindful of that. We are waiting for the lunch and everything. So let's say that when I say hi, you say hello, and when I say hello, you say hi. Okay, hi, hello, hi, hi, hello, hi. All right, thank you very much. Please have your seat. It's wonderful to be here. I would like to thank Kenyatta University for this. I would say all these presentations. The fellows have worked really hard, and so did their supervisors. Now, at the beginning, I would like to introduce the 2 panelists sitting there on that side. First, I have Dr. Jeffrey Logano from the Department of History, Archaeology, and Political Science at Political Studies, Kenyatta University. And we also have Professor John Riley, Legrand Ramsey Professor of Anthropology, Bard College, New York, and lead researcher, Rift Valley Institute, South Sudan Customary Authorities Project. When I was listening to these presentations, these wonderful presentations, I was thinking how the first session, which was moderated by Mike, and this session are kind of synchronized with each other, because the first one is more about education, and this session is, if we look at these presentations, are broadly talking about identities, hopes, and aspirations, and how to move forward, and that's how life is. Now, before I kind of sum up my comments, I would like to go to Dr. Jeffrey Logano. I'm going to short circuit this session because we all are hungry and waiting for lunch. I'll give you 5 minutes to make your comments and your points to all these presenters here. I'm going to pass this microphone.
So thank you, Sadat, and our presenters. Thank you for your wonderful presentations. We really learned a lot. So for me, one emerging thread from all your presentations is the kind of stories that you're revealing from the voices at the margins, people whom we hardly hear from. And part of what is revealed from your presentations is the complexities that come from these voices. And these complexities, at least you really try to unpack them, and beginning from Tacit's explanations of how these borderland communities straddling across Somalia and Ethiopia have experiences that are manifested in stories. But perhaps what we missed in your presentation, because I've been following Ethiopian affairs for a long time, and I'm building back on your methodology. You talked about poetic expressions. You talked about relying on poems from these communities. So I wanted to see these kind of expressions, these poetic expressions, when talking about the lived experiences. So part of what we should have seen is these poems from these communities really telling or narrating their stories. But also, what really struck me from your presentation is the idea of Ethiopia as a colonizer and Ethiopia as the colonized. So what is the place of language in all this? Because from one of my friends who is also at Chigaga, I got the impression that the idea of language, and especially Amharic, has been used as part of this colonizing project. So where's the place of the Ethiopian Amharic language in your story? So that was really missing. Then going into it was also a beautiful story of expounding on how the South Asian communities have been at the margins despite their contributions to Kenya's post-colonial project. But I'm not sure about this framing of South Asians. So I don't know really if well, this is one monolithic group. South Asia is quite a big geographical space. We have the Indians, we have Vietnamese, we have Nepalese. So is it really the case that the Indians in Kenya prefer to be categorized as South Asians, this monolithic group that lumps up all these groups together? And I'm also not really sure about your expression of how the history of South Asians has been one-dimensional and static. So how is it really static when I see continuous expressions of these communities in terms of politics? If you look at politics, we have a member of parliament, I think Dawood from Mount Kenya. We have Sakil Shabir, who has been continuously contesting for elections and winning in Kisumu. He's currently a member of parliament. And in fact, he went against the wave of the dominant party in that region, right? So to what extent do we think of these communities as being static? We also see them in businesses. So really, you really have to unpack your idea of the communities being static. And part of this could be perhaps to recast these communities' lived experiences in the context of an evolving and dynamic country. And that will lead you into explaining how they have been able to repackage themselves, how they have been able to adapt to these changing circumstances of the majority Kenyan populations, not as now the subalterns, but as now the owners of the state. So then how do these Indian communities, who used to have at least some semblance of domination, how do they adapt to these alternating circumstances they find themselves in? So that really should be the crucifix of your discussions. And I also enjoyed your discussions of how we've had a displacement of the dominant established NGOs with these marginal centers, just centers. But I'm not really sure, or it didn't really come out from your presentation, to what extent have these alternative spaces of human rights advocacy been successful, especially on what you talked about with regards to Article 43, that is the focus of their advocacy, the idea of fighting for social justice. So to what extent have they really put social justice as part of the political agenda that really displaces these presumptions or preoccupation with civil and political rights that have been at the center of the dominant and established NGOs. And then the question begs also, when you talk about these NGOs, these social justice centers also having collaborative ventures with the more established ones, and the question then begs, how else then, how further will they really go with regards to establishing a distinct identity as an actor that is moving away from the dominant or the established way of advocating for human rights? And then, do you think that when donors come in, the kind of agenda that they proclaim to be distinctively their own will be kind of muddled or rather displaced? And so those really come clear from your presentations. But otherwise, I really enjoyed your discussions and thank you for your wonderful contributions.
Thank you. Thank you. That's wonderful and very thorough review of these presentations. I'd like to go to Professor John Riley for his comments, and you have 5 minutes, John.
Thank you very much. Yes, I have one question actually for all three of the presenters. I have some thanks as well, and we've had a lot of thanks today, quite rightly. People should be thanks. These occasions are difficult to organize, and it's the culmination of a long process, and one that I was involved with at the beginning, and I'm very proud to see today these 7 fellows, well, we've seen, yes, I think 7, who are the product of an oral history seminar, oral history and oral literature seminar that I started with Dr. Tom Odhiambo, who unfortunately can't be here today, 2 years ago. They're graduates of it, or the ones here anyway. And this was a very fruitful course, I think, which has perhaps embedded the idea of oral history in some of the researchers. So I think, first of all, I have to thank, on behalf of myself and Dr. Tom, we have to thank Dr. Rebecca for being generous with the time and space at the beginning of the Osun program in Eastern Africa, for giving us the opportunity to do that. I also should thank Mike Oyo and Doris Koki, who are constituent parts of OSU here. I think they've been thanked already. I won't thank Dr. Brazilla, Dr. Richard, Professor Vincent, Dr. Rosemary. Rosemary, actually, I will thank, because she's really, the legacy of this has really been embraced, I think, by her and the Osun staff in the last 6 months or a year. And what was a bare piece of land we were given has now sprouted many trees, to use a very corny metaphor. Who else should I thank? We're in the Confucius Institute. Should I thank Confucius? Probably not. So I think one thing that's very striking to me about, especially about Sam and Tursit's presentations, is that this is research with members of communities of which they are not a part. Different languages, different religions, different histories, sometimes oppositional histories, complicated, entwined histories, like all histories are. And this gives their research a special quality, an impressive quality. I mean, I'm lucky enough to know some of the people in Somaliland that Tursit works with, and also several of Sam's informants. And I know they thought very, very highly of them as researchers and really appreciated their involvement. And that's kind of not always the case. I think it's very passionate engagement with the subject which characterizes all of them, and also, of course, Akoko's research, because he's an example of something slightly different, which is a scholar who is deeply engaged and a participant in the process that he is chronicling. And there were many, many interesting things in their presentations, and some which were quite new to me and revelatory. I mean, if anything could keep you awake, it's kept me awake, and I didn't get much sleep because I arrived very late last night. And I have one question for them, really, which is, how has the experience of this research affected their identity, their sense of their own community? Has it changed? Has it deepened? Or even their theoretical positions, because theory does follow experience and intellectual engagement. And that's the question I'd like to ask them. Thank you.
Would you like to answer?
Thank you, both panelists. And yeah, I will answer also the first question, or it's kind of a comment, but I'll address it. I think it's running through your slides. Sometimes you just skip off and then it doesn't emphasize on them. But I agree. I mean, it didn't come out in my presentation, the essence of the place of the poetry and the songs. But I have placed it in the writing, especially one I want to mention is Muste Ali Furur, which is one of the prominent poets in the Somali in general, but specifically for Somalian community. And he has a poetry which is called Butros Butros Gali. And I know it's funny, but he is kind of addressing, during that time, Butros Butros Gali was the UN chairperson and secretary actually. And he was saying, you are siding with the oppressor, which they were fighting Somalia. And then he actually have a specific element when he says, I'm not teaching my children anymore to hate Ethiopians. And if war comes, I'm gonna, you know which side I'm gonna be fighting with. So yes, I kind of place this in the writing. And Marine Mursal is another significant singer. I mean, most of you know her from the illegal migration campaigning songs. And she also kind of narrates her experience in the migration, passing from Somali to Kenya and then passing through Ethiopia and all the way. And then she has one phrase which says like, all the characterization he gave me, I met people who are kind and different completely from what I know. So these are kind of things which not only their understanding of perception, but also help the community to grapple from them. So, but I agree, it didn't come in the presentation. And when it comes to the Amharic and the language, yeah, again, the default of Habashi, and then Christian, Amhara, Highlander, this all is embedded together. And then that's why not only the Somalis, but the other ethnic groups also see it as an imposition. And they say, no, I'm not a Habesha, I am an Oromo. No, I'm not an Habesha, I am this one, another ethnic group. So I kind of put in detail in the paper, but you're right, I didn't put them in. To answer, John, your question is, how the experience has been. As I said, I wanted to be a defiant. I did not want to take the story as it is from the beginning, and it taught me a lot. When I was young, actually, as I said, it's very early that I wanted to understand the Somalis with them by being part of them. So that's why I decided by myself to go to Jijiga University in opposition to where I was assigned to go to one of the universities in Tigray. So it helped me to understand and theorize that it takes engagement, it takes to get connected, it takes to push the barriers and experience it for yourself to be able to talk about the communities and then help in changing the narrations. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So I think let me just respond to the questions that have been raised. I think with regards to the paper Ogot was referring to, I think the comment Akoko raised, Ogot actually talks about that paper in his book, Zamani. And I think this is the whole basis of academic discourse, which is now debate. And I think after this, I'll pick it up with Akoko to see how that progresses. Now, history as monolithic and static, I actually said that the history of the South Asian community in Kenya is anything but monolithic and static, meaning that it's actually evolved over time. When Pinto was assassinated, there was a period of silence in the South Asian community with regards to politics. But then again, in the recent past, we've seen a vibrancy of the community participating in politics. And so how do I conceive the South Asians? The South Asians, I see them as people who came to Kenya. I mean, these, I think Pakistani, that area, I really don't have the geographical essence in mind, but I think the people who came to Kenya during the colonial periods, so that that is what I mean. How has this affected my identity? I think one of the things I learned is patience, especially with Zarina Patel, who was my last respondent. I was almost giving up on her because we couldn't meet at certain timelines and they kept on moving, but so I had just to be patient with her and hope that eventually I'll have a big breakthrough, which happened. So it taught me patience. And I think also humility, yeah, so that to learn and hear from them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. To respond to Dr. Lugano's questions. So to what extent are these centers emerging as autonomous institutions and players in human rights space as actors in their own right? That's where the struggle is. When I last did an interview in Mathare, my respondent asked me to go to Mathare. They're very proud of the center. So despite all those things or refilling in the IRB protocols, they insist that their work is legitimate and has to be visible. So he says you have to come to Mathare, and we sat right at the edge of the building where the Social Justice Center is housed. And he was just about to go into a meeting, and his last words were, he was struggling with the NGOs who are poaching members of his community. That once he's trained these people to do the human rights work, the bigger brothers offer them better salaries, better terms of service, and they're leaving. And he was also struggling with getting complete community acceptance. Although this human rights work is valuable and has earned them respect, a good number of other actors within the community think that it is too risky and attracting a lot of bad government attention. So he still has a long way to go. And again, if you look at the activities of, say, like Amnesty International Qua Ground, which is Amnesty International's response to try and work out a partnership with the social justice movement, then the fear that he has of NGO capture, the fear he has of NGOs poaching threatens the movement within. Another of the respondents said that there's a lot of infighting now within the movements as money come in, and all will depend on to the extent then that they can be able to address these issues of resources and NGO opportunism in that sense. The agenda around Article 43 is an interesting one because it is very hard. It says, as one of them told me, we can only count on our big brothers to come and bail us out because they have funds for that kind of work. They need to report that how many they've bailed out in a year who are victims of violence. But to get support, to organize and these people to join us is still hard. In other words, it is not an agenda that has been embraced by others beyond, especially the middle class NGOs have not embraced it as a human rights issue in that sense. So it is in that sense then that you say the charge that has been made that human rights is counter-revolutionary by people like Robert Meister comes into mind. That what is it good for? Is it anything that comes close to addressing social justice issue? Then Robert Meister's study of After Evil, the politics of human rights, which looks at South African case in details, and looks at the kind of experience Kenya has gone through in which you have liberal transitional sets of institutions that are put on a society to try and transform it, things like TGRC, which you study, ICC, and constitutions, hardly ever address this kind of socio-economic right issues. You have the TGRC, which for Kenya, luckily, unlike South Africa, did address issues around socio-economic injustices, but it addresses issues of socio-economic injustices of the past, not the present. It has nothing on the present socio-economic injustices. So that's still a tall order. So how has this thing affected me? Well, when you go to Mathare for work and other places, you discovered how privileged and lucky you are. Because in that meeting, I mean, we sit by the edge of the office, and a police green, jungle green Land Cruiser of the administration police pulls up, and out of it comes a policeman, tucks in his shirts, and clips his gun on his hips, visible. In Kenya, you can go for days without seeing guns that way. It's not Uganda where on a good day, Museveni can wake up and station an APC outside the classroom. Here you can go for weeks without seeing guns. But in Mathare, then you see another face of state terror. And my friend tells me now this one has come to collect money for the big boss. He must be an OCPD commanding station or officer commanding station. And he's here to collect money for illegal businesses. So exploitation and oppression go hand in hand in Mathare. And it is at the most brutal end of society. Deprived of anything that remotely comes to privacy, deprived of access to clean water, where cartels contain who gets water, or NGOs can give you that on a basis of charity. You come across and say you're truly privileged, and the other half, or no, more than half of Kenya really lives a terrible life.
While you have that microphone, I just want to ask you one question. Why did you identify only NGOs as Center for Social Change, not other institutions like universities or think tanks?
Interesting. Universities are conservative and reactionary as they can be in this part of the world.
And from me is you have, I can see that you have emphasized on human rights. Why human rights is the only tool you are mentioning for social justice? And I have got only 4 minutes. I've got Dr. Rosemary breathing on my shoulder. I have to finish it. Food is getting cold. I give you 1 minute to respond on that.
So human rights, because you see, after the enactment of the Constitution of Kenya 2010, you get a movement that expressly invokes Article 1 of the Kenyan Constitution, the chapter on Bills of Rights, and Article 43 as a basis of organizing. So that means that they place human rights as a center stage of it. But then this is a carryover from their big brothers. That their big brothers did identify constitutional reform from 1992 on as a way of changing Kenya, so that the best book that comes out of that moment is Willy Mutunga's Constitution Making from the Middle. If you read it, it hardly addresses anything on socio-economic rights or land, for that matter, in Kenya. 2 burning issues in Kenya. So then this one is striking because then they take over from what has not been addressed by the previous movements. And this particular act I'm talking about had been a member of these movements. So it kind of has a history and embodies the struggle from that time on. So that's when then I pick that strand of history and struggle for me.
Thank you. I would like to bring this session to an end with my comments. The first two presenters, sorry if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly, I apologize for that. Tersit and Sam Dennis Otieno. You know, it was wonderful to hear about how these communities have come closer or integrated. But what I was also thinking that how we identify people with all these very artificial identities, saying someone is Kenyan, someone is Ethiopian, someone is Somali, you know, all these. But on the other hand, you know, but when I was listening to Jacob's presentation, and he was talking about human rights, and I was thinking, there you go. Human rights only identify as us as human. And when we can actually delete these artificial identities of us, and that is when we can really truly identify ourselves as human and truly talk about human rights. And I really like the way Sam actually tried to define belonging, and he was mentioning somewhere as gravitating away, even though we are in person, we are present somewhere. Actually, that really caught my attention. But end of the day, what I see that these presentations, these researches are resonating what we call hopes and aspirations of the people. And I really thank you for the wonderful presentation and answering these questions. I would like to thank this audience for listening to this conversation, and the two panelists for their contribution. Thank you. I think we can all go for lunch.
Thank you so much. I think that is very, very good. Let's give them a round of applause. Thank you so much. Now, I think just like the moderator indicated, it's been complex. It actually reminds me of my father because he was a historian, and he would ever tell me about the London Bridge that is broken. So I was wondering, what is this London Bridge and what is it talking about? But when I listened to these people, I think the London Bridge was really broken. So we have finished that. I want to thank the panelists for doing a beautiful job. They understood the whole context and they were able to, share with us. And I think really under the mentorship or moderation of Professor Shaharia, because as a peace and justice fellow, he ensured that now we don't talk because we are hungry and we have to go and eat. So that is why we've left it. Even here, I have a big question that I'd written, but we just have to leave them. I think I'll give it to Tacit so that she answers that question. So I want to say thank you so much. KU is a big institution. We should have been hosted actually in one of the halls that we are very much aware of in KUCC, Kenyatta University Center, Conference Center. So they insisted that we can't eat lunch here because they are our host. So we are all getting into the bus that they've brought, and we are going to take our lunch, and we are now leaving at almost past, so I'm giving ourselves 45 minutes. We eat and come back. Thank you so much for being patient, and be blessed. Thank you. Let's move down. Those who
driving and riding